Welcome to the Game Week podcast powered by Keros, the number one solution for maximizing preparation and performance in elite sport. I'm your host, Andrew Trimble, and every episode will be taking a deep dive behind the scenes of the elite sports world as we chat with key stakeholders in high-performance environments about their stories and how they manage their game week. Tom has worked with teams and individuals at the highest level of professional sport, providing psychological support to organisations and individuals from the world of rugby union, football, boxing, rallying, track and field, and golf. Most recently, he's been part of the coaching team to European Tour and Ryder Cup golfer Tommy Fleetwood and worked as a consultant to St. Helen's Rugby League, the Belgian national team, ahead of the World Cup in Russia, and the victorious European Ryder Cup Team in Paris 2018. Tom is also the author of critically acclaimed book, The Making of a Leader. Okay, Tom, welcome along to the Keros podcast. Let's start very simply. Why do you do what you do?
That's never a simple question, is it really? I don't think. I think that changes. The answer to that question changes. So I think when I started out, it was to help people understand the role of the brain, the role of their thoughts and beliefs, and how that drives performance. And I think probably on a basic level, that's still the same in terms of why I do what I do. But I think now it's probably with a little bit more experience, it's probably more about really understanding people's journeys, understanding really what makes them tick and helping them to thrive, whether that is on the field, if we're talking about a team sport, or actually just as a human being. So I think the role of a psychologist now, there is performance elements, of course, but there's also more awareness of that well-being perspective that I think there's more of a conversation around that. So I think it does evolve that question really. On a selfish level, kind of my own purpose, what I really enjoy is just working with interesting people. So sometimes people think that's always going to be athletes or sports teams, things like that. But I'm fortunate that I work with businesses or I work with people who are doing, crazy challenges for charity. So I think of a group of guys who are rowing across the Atlantic for charity at the moment. So working with interesting people from my own point of view, that's what really gets me going, I suppose.
Well, let's dig into that, Tom, at some stage, though, because I'm interested to see the kind of crossover and the similarities between some of the business people you work with and some of the sports people, because the trend is, or the kind of widely held thought out there is that there's a big crossover in it and it's easy to transfer. As someone who has transferred, I find it very difficult. Anyway, we can dig into that, but what you said there, Tom, about I suppose working with them from a performance perspective, but working with them as individuals to improve them as people, or to not to improve them as people, but I suppose to be mindful of the person rather than just the performer. Tell us a little bit more about that and how those two sit together, because we've talked about this in previous podcasts actually, and this is a theme that's come up a few times.
Yeah, I would always say person first, athlete second. I think when you start working in this field, it's very easy as a practitioner to think, how can I help this person? What strategy or technique can I try and give this person? And I was definitely guilty of that when I kind of started out. I think actually it's more important to understand that person's journey, because fundamentally I always kind of have to remind myself really that that person or that group of people are the experts in their own journey. So until you start to really understand what their purpose might be or what their values might be, you're never going to get beyond the surface. You're always just going to be looking at maybe sticking plaster approaches, something that might help in the short term on the field or when they're performing, but actually to work towards somebody's potential, you really do have to understand them as an individual, or at least start that process. Because with some people, you gain that connection quite quickly, and I think people are quite open. With some people, it just takes a little bit longer for them to show that vulnerability or to build that trust. But until you can understand the person, it's very hard to separate that from the athlete. In when you're working with someone, and you've almost got to take the time to do that. So whether that's in a team environment where you've got to build relationships quite informally, or whether that's with an individual client where it's really understanding the journey they've been on, their values, what they hold close, and then how that translates into their performance. And that would always be where I would start.
And so not everybody's the same, obviously. Have you spotted a trend? We spoke to some performance coaches in an academy setup, so younger people, I would assume that younger people are easier to mold or more responsive to that sort of coaching or input. Have you found that in your experience?
Yeah, I think that probably is one trend. I think it depends on the environment those young people are in, and and where we class young people. I've been into environments where you might be working with kind of under 18s, under 23 groups in football squads, and they're at that kind of crucial junction between, that young academy player to suddenly making that transition, or not suddenly, but to making that transition into the first team. And at that point, that vulnerability or that openness can be quite difficult to get, because they might be concerned about what the senior coaches or the senior players might make judgments on, or their perceptions of certain things. I think if you can make psychology a normal part of somebody's preparation, somebody's work, somebody's awareness at a very early stage, even at a very, very basic level, and it doesn't have to be, and one of the things I'm quite passionate about is kind of getting psychology out of the classroom. It doesn't have to be kind of formal education psychology, but just making it part of what we do as with young people, whether you're in an academy or whether you're actually just at school. As you can build that on, when you get to 18s, 23s, going into a first team, psychology should just be part of what you do. It is anyway, because we're all thinking all the time, right?
Being aware of it should be what you do, I suppose.
Exactly. Being aware of it, being aware of our tendencies, being aware of what can help us, where we might hold ourselves back, starting to build that awareness as a journey, rather than seeing psychology as something that comes in when there's a problem. And at the same time, I think sometimes when players are at a senior level, I've worked with players at senior level in recent years where I've been amazed by the openness. Maybe they've just gone through that period where they're just comfortable in their own skin, and they're the leaders of the group. They're open, they're honest, they say when they let themselves down, they lead by example, but at the same time, they're not superhuman. And that can be really rewarding from my perspective. So almost two ends of the spectrum. And then maybe there's the middle group that is kind of a little bit more worried about what other people might be thinking, or the judgments that people are making, which is, I suppose, completely understandable in that world.
I think that's very similar to what anecdotally what my experience has been of some people in that environment. And again, like openness, we're talking about the openness of a person, I suppose, the personality, but very much that kind of goes into what we're talking about here with the psychology and being open to new approaches and something that you haven't considered before. Yeah. I think there's a period of an athlete's career, kind of late 20s, and you have to. What your assumptions are coming into that environment as a youngster, you get away with a lot of stuff, and then you start to get to the point where you start to get away with it slightly less, and it's almost like, oh, I need to go back here and re-examine what I'm doing, what I stand for, and what my whole approach is, and I just need to know myself better. So maybe that might be that period, kind of late 20s. I think that's my theory. That's my thesis.
Well, you've done it, haven't you? So you've gone through that process and that journey, and I think you're right. I think there is that. You are building that awareness as you go through that journey, and you probably get to the point. Someone said to me in the last couple of months, I didn't realize early enough in my career. This was a senior player in an individual sport, actually. Someone who's probably in a position now to hand advice down to younger players. So as a golfer, and he said, I wasted too much energy trying to be something that I wasn't, or somebody that I wasn't. And in reality, what you've got and who you are is already enough. It's what you do with that really drives towards that potential. But you're kind of saying you only really realise that once you're maybe at a certain point, and where that point is probably is different in different sports.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to ask you. Do you see a difference? You're working with rugby league now, soccer. I'm saying soccer because we've been speaking to American people all summer as part of the Techstars. But so football, rugby, and golf. Do you see different trends or different understandings or different cultures kind of impacting how people approach different things?
I think in golf, obviously, the demands are very different. It's a very individual sport, of course, a completely individual sport, apart from the odd team match. And you have a longer career. So you'll see Phil Mickelson winning the PGA. That's just the equivalent of that. Just probably isn't going to happen. Or you see Ronaldo and people like that at 36, 37. He's not going to be doing that at 46, 47. I don't think. I mean, wouldn't quite put it past him. But so I do think that changes. I think the culture of those sports. I think I'd probably, you could quite easily, whether it's lazy, clump those team sports together: rugby league, soccer, football. I think it's the quality of the conversations you have probably during that, and the culture that you're in, that would probably dictate that openness. So working in rugby league, what I was surprised at probably going in was that openness and that honesty and that vulnerability, because there was just no BS with it. And
that's not the assumption looking in from the outside in rugby league. That's not what people would expect. They would expect a more of a macho environment.
Exactly. And I think and that's where you've got to look at it case by case basis, I would say, in terms of the environment that creates. And I think in general, we're moving towards something people's awareness is building, that actually being open and being honest is actually a sign of mental strength, not a sign of mental weakness. And I think that's something that is shifting in different sports as we kind of go through this, the last 5 years, and as we move forward. I do think that is shifting, but you've got to look at each team or each group on its own, really.
Yeah, gotcha. Tom, how let's talk about kind of the influences on you and your journey, and how your approach was formed, and then how your approach is maybe being challenged as you've experienced more people, and even you being open-minded. Tell us a little bit about that, and have you ever had a mentor or someone who stood out, who had a significant impact on you and the way you think?
Yeah, I mean, I got into sports psychology. It wasn't a master plan. I think you speak to students, I went back to my old uni at Lancaster and spoke to a group of undergrads, and I think they kind of expected you had like this kind of master plan. And I initially studied normal psychology. So I say normal, just mean it wasn't sports psychology. We didn't actually do a module on that at that point. It was all these different elements of psychology, which was a great grounding. But I didn't go and do that thinking I'm going to be a sports psychologist. That wasn't the kind of the plan at that point. It was a little bit like, I don't really know what I'm going to do, so I'll do something that you can kind of do lots of things from it, but there's nothing too driven into it. And I was always passionate about sport, so I always enjoyed playing football. I always enjoyed playing rugby union, mainly team sports. Even though I work a lot in golf now, I wasn't a golfer. Still wouldn't class myself as a golfer, as you know.
First hand. I know
exactly. Well, yeah, we won't talk too much about that. So I think I was probably, as a player, quite a nervous athlete. I would say I overthought things. I was better in training than I was in matches. Someone used to have to get me really angry in order to kind of unleash a bit more aggression or assertiveness or whatever. So I was quite cautious. So probably not saying I would have been in the Premier League, but probably didn't achieve what I maybe could have done. So maybe on a deeper level, that kind of drove an interest in sports psychology. And then as I went through that process of kind of study, I remember someone saying to me, "Oh, where are you doing your masters?" And I thought, I don't really want to do a masters. I want to get out of uni and out of that academic world. But I did a little bit of work experience with a business that's up here in Preston with someone that I knew really well, kind of knew the family, and I'd reached out. And I ended up working there. And so that was probably my first kind of mentor, I suppose, who kind of, I would say, gave me a lot of opportunity, learned a lot of things from, and backed me as well, saw something in me, and I think appreciated kind of someone reaching out and chancing their arm and being proactive and working for free and all these kind of things. So that was a really kind of formative relationship where I got lots of opportunities, but I also worked really hard. So I was driving people around, I was invoicing, I was then delivering stuff in schools, I was then getting the opportunity to work with the odd athlete, understanding how to run a small business, things like that. So that was really formative. And then as you go through that journey, I think people come and go. So even now, I'll have people I look up to in the field of psychology who might be classed as a peer, but I would always say they're probably, a little bit further ahead on their journey than me, who I'm able to reach out to. So yeah, I think it's an ongoing process, but I've definitely had a couple of people in that journey who were big parts of that. But one of the things, going back to that visit to Lancaster Uni, it's a really important thing. Whatever area of sport, and I'm sure you've had other people on that would say the same, you've got to be proactive in terms of reaching out for those opportunities, because the worst that someone's going to say is no. So I've always been pretty good at that. That's probably one thing I've always, backed myself on in terms of putting myself out there, contacting people. If someone says no, then you never know, in 5 years' time, they might say yes. So building those relationships, I think, has been key as well.
Yeah. So, but you said you were a nervous athlete, or you're kind of maybe concerned about what might go wrong, or what could I do wrong here rather than what I could do right on the pitch. And I've had conversations on the pitch with teammates, and we've like knowing each other very well. One teammate in particular we would have said, let's be brave today, let's be tough, let's be brave, let's go after things, let's take risks. And it's weird how that is actually a big challenge at that level.
Yeah.
But so I would assume that then maybe you weren't the type of person who would be brave and not reaching out to people and what's the worst could happen here. So how did that transition happen from you on the pitch to your I suppose your performance to your personal life or your professional life, I suppose?
I think I've always, yeah, it's a really good question. I've never actually thought about it like that. I think being cheeky is different to kind of performing under pressure, if you will. So I would still, even now, I'll overthink. I'll get a little bit nervous about things, but I've got the experience that I know I can deliver on that. I think as a young athlete at 15, 16, 17, you kind of, I think it's the expectation that you put on yourself in order to be, whether it's perfect or just to do really well. And if, like for me, I was often labelled as like a bad loser. Like people would see emotional reactions, but it wasn't. And I see this a lot in athletes now, but it wasn't because I was losing. It was because I wasn't performing to the level I expected of myself. So that's still probably today something I have to manage. It's just that with experience, you get better at managing it, don't you? And my performance now is probably, I don't play football anymore, don't play rugby anymore. My performance is at work, I suppose. So you just got a little bit more experience in managing those. Those traits haven't disappeared. I'm probably just more aware, like we were talking about before, and just have a better way of probably being aware of my own internal narrative at that perspective.
Yeah. So even if naturally, maybe this is the case for me, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but for me, naturally, I wouldn't have been a confident performer. I wouldn't have swaggered out in the pitch and thought this performance was just going to come together. So I had to manage that performance, and a big part of me growing and maturing and being confident that I was going to be able to deliver on the pitch was someone backing me. And you mentioned that someone backs you. It's mad how the impact that can have, and the thought, like the really simple conclusion you come to there is, this person's prepared to back me, then it makes sense that I got to back myself. Is that an experience that you've had as well?
Yeah, I think sometimes people give you responsibility. Some people grasp responsibility, don't they? And they kind of push themselves to the front, and they kind of move towards challenges and would always try and take the lead. And it's not that you have to be like that in order to be an elite performer. Like there isn't a kind of, I think sometimes people talk about, I definitely hear this high performance mindset, like those kind of words that come out all the time. I get what the people are saying, but your high performance mindset might be different to that teammate that you were talking about before, or might be different to the other 14 guys on the field, or slightly different. It's about finding your mindset. I was always someone that if I was given responsibility, I would thrive on it, but I wouldn't walk up to someone and take that responsibility. So the behavior or the performance increase is still there, but the kind of the act that provides it is something that is external to me. So someone has to give me that responsibility, which is effectively that backing that you're describing. And then this is as a kid, and probably what I didn't have then was an understanding of psychology. So one of the things I'm really passionate about is trying to make psychology, like I said before, just something that's a little bit more accepted, which I think it is. I think there's loads of examples now where people are talking about this stuff more. Kids are learning about it in schools, learning about it in academies, realizing that you don't have to be a certain way in order to do this. You can just be you, but it's bolting skills onto that, bolting awareness onto that. So I think that's something for young people is really important to understand. And that's probably why, from that early experience that I had. I mean, don't get me wrong, it wasn't like a traumatic experience. It's just something that probably on a deeper level held me back a little bit, that's maybe prompted me to get into this field and understand it a little bit more.
Yeah, okay. So maybe, and this sounds like it was something similar to your experience, understanding yourself more, understanding what makes you tick, and understanding what allows yourself to get the best out of yourself, or the best performance in place. So that comes down to confidence. A lot of that is about confidence, and it's not just an irrational confidence. It's not like tricking yourself to be confident. It's having a logical, rational, I'm confident because I'm prepared in this way and I know what makes me tick. This preparation has led to this performance in the past. Rationally, it's likely I'm going to perform today. It's that kind of process. I think, again, that I'm talking about me. It sounds like something maybe similar for yourself.
Yeah.
But so I have such an emphasis on confidence and trying to understand yourself and get to that level of confidence. But we were just talking about the individuals and how everybody's different. And that teammate, actually, you're right, that teammate that I'm talking about is very different. Although we had that in common, we're very different mindsets. And would you ever find yourself trying to understand the individual? I know you're big on the profiles and understanding every individual athlete as an individual, and tap into something unique about them. Would you ever find yourself sometimes for one athlete, it's get confidence out of this person or find a way to get them confident, and for another person it'd be, let's take the edge out of their confidence, they're a little bit too confident. Is it that bespoke and unique to the individual?
First of all, I think confidence is often talked about, maybe externally, as something you've either got or you haven't, when in reality, if you think about it as like a tank that you're almost constantly kind of filling up, and a past performance will increase it, a poor performance might decrease it, rather than talking it about like something that's almost absolute. And I think we do fall into these when we're talking about the narratives of sport. When you're looking at an individual, people can be overconfident 100%, where they think maybe, you're going to turn up and just do what I need to do, and that'll get in the performance, and that'll almost to a point of arrogance, and thinking the skill level I have is easily going to meet this challenge that we're going to face. So I think sometimes it's reminding people, bringing that confidence down to that sweet spot, and I think that's the coaches. So for instance, I wouldn't see that as my role necessarily, the way that I would work. I think predominantly a psychologist often works through the coaches. So you wouldn't want to reduce someone's confidence, really, but if you saw it straying into either irrational, I think the word you used, or unrealistic, or almost to the point where you think, that can't be real, that confidence. It's almost to the point where it's fake, and it's something that's being forced upon. That's when you've got to maybe just remind them, and not remind them by saying, remember, you're not that good, but remind them by saying, these are the things you need to do on the field. This is what the team needs from you. This is what I need from you as a leader. So I think those kind of things, definitely understanding that individual. I think one of the things that's quite easy to do, you look around the changing room and you see someone who's really extrovert, and we go, confident. Don't worry about him, really confident, laughing, joking, brilliant. Let's worry about that quiet person in the corner. And you all know from being in team environments that quiet person in the corner might be the most confident, most self-assured, most relaxed individual in there, and they perform week in, week out. And the extrovert is someone who actually underneath is a little bit more anxious, a little bit more overthinking, but on the surface we see this bubbly character. So it's understanding from a coaching perspective, well, what do we say what is confidence? Is it something that we're labeling from behavior that we see, or is it something that we get from the dialogue with the player and our understanding of that human being? So I can think of a couple of athletes who, like you mentioned, profiles, we'll do a profile with them, and there will be, yes, I'm an extrovert individual, but underneath the things we don't see is this overthinking, this anxiousness. What if this doesn't happen? What do they think of me? Do they think I'm a good person? Do they not like me? You get some of that, but on the surface, we just see the extroversion. So I think from a coaching perspective, it's about questioning what we see and making sure that our biases aren't kind of running wild in those situations as well.
Yeah, gotcha. You mentioned, Tom, I suppose speaking through the coaches, or coaching the coaches to be able to communicate that message correctly. How does that change between sports? Because fundamentally, the coach isn't on the pitch for football and rugby, but I suppose the coach in a way is kind of the caddy in golf, and they're right there beside them the whole time. Is it a different approach for those two inputs?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, fundamentally, it comes back to the same thing in terms of understanding the people. The caddy and the golfer, their partnership is very close. It's only those two involved at that point on the golf course. So, the role of the caddy is vital in terms of communication, decision making, managing reactions, things like that. And you're right, you can walk around with a golfer, even from a coach's perspective, kind of. You can walk around the practice round right next to them. You go to the football and the soccer and the rugby. I think working through the coaches is done fundamentally, and it's not just coaches, it's physios, it's the medical staff, it's analysts. I think you're looking at it more from a kind of point of almost aggregation, where you want to improve every little interaction, if you can, between staff and player. Building trust, building that psychological safety that people talk about, building those relationships. if you work through the coaches, what I would try and do is with the coaches, by the way, one of the worst things, or one of the things I always try and avoid, is you feel like sometimes you're going in telling the coaches how to do their job. Normally, these guys are pretty good at what they do already. So you're just trying to add some awareness or build the awareness of that psychological side onto that. So I'd be having meetings or delivering kind of conversations and information around personalities or behavioral preferences. How do we communicate with different players? If a player's injured, do they want loads of information and really understand it? Do they want to be set a really aggressive target? Are they going to go away and understand it themselves and do a load of reading, things like that? How do we then tailor our approach to them? And then during the course of a training week or a build-up week to a match, I suppose it's about making sure that each player has what they need. So who needs the reassurance? I try and avoid saying who needs an arm around the shoulder and who needs a kick, but it's a little bit like that. Who can be left on their own because they're going to get on with it, they're going to deliver, they're experienced enough. So it's much more. I mean, Sean Dyche, who I interviewed for the book, called it horse whispering. So he'll let his coaches do a lot of the hands-on coaches, and he'll kind of pick people off. So that was his little word for that. So I think in a team sport, you've got the luxury of kind of time with those coaches, and you've got the fact that you build up during a week for one match. In something like golf, you're just following the sun, you're playing each week. So that relationship with the caddy is vital, yeah. But the principle is still the same. You're understanding the individual and tailoring coaching and communication to that.
I've definitely had a few horse whispers in my days. And I can remember one of them that I don't think the coach got the reaction that he was looking for. Okay. It was a wet, windy day, and I was the youngster on the wing. So obviously they're going to pepper me with the kicking game. And the coach's input was, listen, if it doesn't start well, don't worry about it. Just relax. I was going, what would make you think it wouldn't start well? So, but I suppose that's just knowing the individual, and that comes on to actually, what you're talking about there. Do you give them a program that's really detailed? Do you kind of dictate the terms to the athlete, or do you, give them ownership and let them create the plan? There's a whole continuum there, isn't there? A whole spectrum of different approaches, and just finding what's right for the individual in terms of ownership, Tom.
Yeah, going back to your example, what that coach was probably trying to do compared to what his actual words were, probably two different things. Like that first bit, if it doesn't start well, if you get rid of that, it's probably quite a good message. It's that translation point, isn't it? It
didn't start well.
Well, he was right then. He was a genius. Put him in the middle. But in terms of that spectrum, like ownership, like people talk about high-performing cultures taking ownership, and I think, is it Harlequins recently? People have talked a lot about that, almost like, and I think from what you read and what you listen, obviously you're not in there, but you pick up things almost like the players just took over and we're going to do what we want, which probably wasn't the case, I imagine, but they just had more input, more ownership, maybe more listening from coaches in a slightly different style. I think the word ownership can sometimes, you've almost got to challenge what that means, because you take your kind of standards or your approach as a player, what you described before, and that kind of overthinking or wanting to have all the information and kind of, and having your own plan and things like that. That can be ownership, or responding well to a structured environment. You still have to go away, take ownership of that, and take care of your own standards. So I think the word ownership can be kind of challenged a little bit between that and just someone who follows instructions, perhaps. I think those two extremes might be a little bit closer than sometimes we talk about. But I think the group can have ownership. So as a group or a team environment, you want to have some ownership, you want to have input, you want to have players who feel they can have an opinion. Even if that opinion might not get the result they want to be able to have it heard. And that's this kind of environment of trust that I think people talk about a lot more than we used to. It's not all about big speeches and things like that. So from a group perspective, I think an element of ownership is brilliant. Senior players leading that, young potential leaders coming through, kind of seeing that that's going to be, like I remember Stuart Lancaster talking to me about in the book about at Leinster, making sure that those young players were able to have a voice, and that was going to be not punished or not kind of derided. It was going to be rewarded. So having that voice, I think, is important on a cultural level. And then on an individual level, again, you've got a whole, we talk about diversity, cognitive diversity, and being able to celebrate people who might think or approach things differently. It's being able to give people who want to know. So if I think of me in that environment, if I was a player or even as a staff member, I want to know where I need to be, what we're going to be talking about, what's going to be happening, what you need to wear, what time everyone's leaving, all those kind of questions, where someone else might go, just rock up, it'll be fine, right? So how do you then tailor for that? So what I really like about what you guys do is that, yes, it hits the sweet spot in terms of, for someone like me who wants that structure and wants that analytical approach, but it would also hit the sweet spot for someone who is more of a big picture thinker, someone who doesn't need loads of detail, but it's going to keep them on track, it's going to keep them focused, it's going to deliver simple messages that means they're going to, maintain those standards of the group. So it hits the different spots. It's not just for someone who's analytical. So I think that continuum that we talk about is interesting, but someone at the top end, someone who's really detailed, is still taking ownership for me. They just want to do that in a really structured way where they know what's coming.
Yeah, there's different types of athletes. As you say, one athlete will just know exactly what they need to do, what boxes they need to tick to be able to perform, and that's, Keros can cover that and provide that information and make sure they know exactly what that where they stand and how confident they should be. Again, that rational confidence. And then there's athletes, as you say, and we've worked with plenty of these guys as well. And we need to be able to support that mindset as well, where maybe they've got a bit of an X factor. Maybe they don't know exactly what makes them tick, but they know at the minute they're ticking. They know, don't overthink this. Just continue. Go out of your way not to think about as much as possible. Yeah, not to cloud things with information. And I think by the sounds of things, Razi Erasmus is that kind of a coach where he just makes it really simple. Do this, this, and this. Yeah. This is what I'm asking of you. So there's no compromise. I can't accept anybody not delivering these things because it's very, very simple, the criteria to us performing. Whereas maybe someone like Joe Schmidt, there's 10, 12, 15 things, but that's a detailed approach, and that's you're tapping into, if most of your team require that information, you're going to get the best out of them. So it's that's really interesting, and I suppose maybe a coach being able to be flexible and look right around my team. I think the balance here is in detail. Let's approach this game plan with detail. Is there an emphasis on coaches having that kind of flexibility and understanding what makes the majority of their team tick?
I think so. I think as a leader, you want to be authentic, don't you? But at the same time, there has to be an element of flexibility within that. So if you do have the kind of core of your group who you think, really analytical, want to kind of know what's happening, want the plan in advance, that's great. You can cater for them. But just because you put that information out there doesn't mean that the person who's a little bit more independent, I think the word maverick is kind of glamorizes some of this stuff a little bit. I'm sure we've kind of had that conversation before, where someone just needs freedom, but they also do need boundaries. Those boundaries are probably just a little bit more flexible than they might be for other people within that group, but the boundaries still have to be there. So giving that information, making sure that that's all out there, helps to provide that as well. So these people who want freedom to act, they want to have their opinions, they want to take responsibility and take ownership of their own preparation, they still fit into that team environment with that element of flexibility. So from a leader's perspective, remaining authentic while still knowing when you have to kind of flex that style. So for instance, if you have someone who's impatient, if you have someone who's fast-paced as a leader, and you've got a one-to-one with a player, that leader, not because they don't care, will probably go, right, 10 minutes, let's rattle through this. Whereas you might know from your relationship with that player that they might need half an hour. Now, you might not have half an hour, but you might have 20 minutes. So being prepared to challenge that blind spot as a leader and go, I'm going to give this player a little bit, or this person a little bit longer than I would naturally do. I'm going to ask an extra question. I'm going to make sure I listen to them. That's an example of flexing your style. Obviously, within the constraints of an environment where you've got loads of different demands, giving someone a little bit more time when naturally you'd just be trying to find a solution and move on to the next thing. That's one example of a leader flexing. It's 10 minutes, but that 10 minutes can make a big difference.
Gotcha. Perfect. Tom, we like to kind of get into the mindset and the approach and how the tone of a squad kind of changes throughout the week and then onto game day. What's for you, game day, maybe by game day you're starting to take a back seat. Maybe a lot of the work's been done in the front end of the week. I don't know, give us a bit of an idea of what the key focuses are on game day. Maybe less is more. Tell us, what's that like for you?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I wouldn't even be there, so it would depend on the work with that squad. And I think people work in different ways. You've got to think about, so going back to working through the coaches, if you truly believe in that and you can leave your ego at the door, then a lot of the work is done at the start of that week, is done at the start of the season when you're setting standards, when you're having those conversations. And also the fact that, and this is a challenge of working in this field sometimes, you do have to have the buy-in from the staff. That's fundamental. And you have to have the buy-in from the players. But being aware that as a psychologist, you're working with people who do take ownership of their own journey. So for instance, you might be in a rugby squad and you might be in the changing room, but individually you might only work with 4 of them. You do some group stuff. It's on culture, it's on behaviours, it's on standards. We have open and honest conversations, but 10 of them might have their own psychologists or might not be into it, or do that independently away from the club. So you've got to be really conscious of that. If I was working with a player at that point of view, at that time, my work will be done in the build-up, I would say. We might have a couple of things immediately before the match that you could class as mental preparation, but for me that starts, whether that's on the Monday or the Tuesday or the Wednesday. I think that's different for different players. But say as a golfer, we would have a mental framework that player works to throughout blocks of the season. So whether that's months or 3 months or even a whole season, we're going to commit to these mental qualities. And then each tournament, there might be slightly different demands depending on the course, depending on the history on that course. What are the qualities we're going to show? But it wouldn't be something that would change every week dramatically. It would be a consistent way of working. So that's a golfer building up through practice rounds into the tournament rounds. If you go into a team environment, each player prepares in their own independent way. I would see my work predominantly having been done beforehand. I wouldn't see myself going around that changing room speaking to people.
It looks panicky if you do, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Horse whispering around everybody.
Horse whispering. Yeah, but I suppose, and people have different approaches to this. I think psychologists being there at the match, if you're part of that group and you're often there, and that just becomes normal, that's great, because you see things you wouldn't normally see. You see things that maybe someone wouldn't tell you about. You see things that someone wouldn't even be aware about. And you see things before and after and during as well. It's the conversations away from the performance zone that I would expect to be most valuable. Yeah,
there's a trust element there as well from coaches. I've been in changing rooms where before the game you're going, it doesn't feel quite right here. And hopefully that's because everybody's kind of quietly going about their business, or everybody's kind of going through that process, that individual process.
Yeah.
But if I've experienced coaches coming in and they've noticed it as well, and they've said, and there's a panic element, and if things don't feel right, they don't feel any more right afterwards, because it's like, oh, if he's panicking, then there must be something to panic about here. There's no element of that. Kind of
transmits through the group.
Yeah. Tell us, Tom, you mentioned there about that individual preparation and what that looks like. My examples were when I worked with a sports psychologist at the time. Whenever I was playing, my confidence again was my big thing, and I was encouraged to make what we called a confidence resume. So I made a list of 10 games, 8 games that I know I'd performed well, and I know there was just something clicked, and I went through this list. And I just reminded myself, just went through in my head my contributions to the game, and it was a good way of getting myself into a good frame of mind. And there was another practical piece of advice kind of in the run up to for me, it was being vocal in a team meeting. And potentially it's box ticking a little bit. There's an element of that, but just being vocal, being dominant, being a leader and contributing something, and just, again, it's exhibiting confidence. And potentially you could say that's fake confidence, but it maybe turned into real confidence. Would have been the way we would have described it. Those were my two practical cues. Can you give us any other examples of anybody you've worked with where you've got like practical cues?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I read about George Ford in the paper this weekend and about him using kind of basically match scripts. So I think they talked about MP3s, and I didn't know they were still about. But using headphones to basically go through match scripts. What does he do? How can he affect the games? What is he like at his best? And I think they were his words, which is effectively kind of what you were doing to an extent, having that idea of what that performance looks like and running that through in your head, which drives pictures, which drives emotions, which is what the brain registers. The brain starts to work on words and pictures and emotions. So that's one example that just came to mind recently. One of the things I've liked seeing as well, and this often comes after retirement, right? Because players start to say what they used to do before matches. So like the All Blacks, like now every so often on social media you'll see like a clip of Richie McCaw or Dan Carter's little notebook before a final or a semi-final. And there's a couple of things I really liked on both of those. So Carter was, I feel nervous. One of the things I saw him write. So he was accepting that he was nervous. He wasn't saying, don't be nervous. He was kind of embracing that's just part of that preparation. So that really resonated with me. And then Richie McCaw always signed it off with GAB, great All Black. And that came from a conversation with, I think, his uncle when he was a kid, who basically said, how are you going to get to being an All Black? And he said, I'm going to do this, I'm going to play for the under-21s, blah, blah, blah. And he did all this, and he did it obviously really fast and had a great career. But his uncle said, are you just going to be an All Black then? Or are you going to be a great All Black? So GAB is always at the bottom of his thing, which is a real emotional kind of tie to what that conversation was. So you can see slightly different approaches, but what comes there is someone writing something down, those intentions, so like you with your confidence resume, what am I going to bring to the team, be vocal, those kind of things. And also after a match, I would encourage someone to have that kind of reflection on how they did because of that, or how they did on those things they were driving towards, or their intentions. In terms of little things I would maybe encourage people to do, a lot of people, you see people with headphones, don't you, all the time as they walk in. So I can think of an American athlete that I've been working with in the last year. Really accomplished athlete. Internal narrative is something we've talked about in terms of getting older and becoming a kind of elder player in the group, and two narratives kind of taking over: the irrational one, which is kind of saying you're too old, like you're past it, and the other one saying you bring all this experience, you read the game great and all this stuff. So we would have an internal script that would be around that, which she would listen to with clips, and that narrative. And then once she's in the changing room, it's an external focus. It's what do I bring to this group? What does that player need? What does this player need? I've done my prep. It's just about getting out there on the field. It's a very individual process, I would say. So you'll have some people who might go in for kind of mindfulness stuff that I think people now talk about and read about a little bit more. Some people will do more breathing exercises, being aware of that breathing process, calming them down or pumping them up. So it's a very, very individual process. You know, one of the things that's probably changed in recent times is that now there's more of an acceptance or more awareness of these kind of things. So I remember seeing something in the Euros of England players lying down on the floor doing a breathing exercise with the psychologist, and this was put onto Instagram. And you think 10 years ago, like, what that would have been almost ridiculed or scoffed at. But that's an example of, I suppose, I can't remember if that was after a game or before a game, but using those kind of techniques to get ready for performance is a lot more accepted. But it's an individual process, I would always say. Understand the person that you're working with and then build something with them that works for them. And if something doesn't work, you try it against one team, or you try it in the first game of the season, or you try it for the first couple of months. It doesn't feel like it's working, and you can tailor it, you can tweak it. It's not like this is my approach and that's it. They can be flexible as well. So it's finding something that really works for that individual.
And so this is my approach for now. This is my approach currently that I know works for me now. but as you say, continually examining that. How have you found? Have you had to react to mindfulness, breathing, meditation, these kind of things that are reasonably new? They might not have been around whenever you were starting your career. Are you expected to be an expert in these? Are you expected to promote these, or are you expected certainly to understand them and know when they're maybe suitable? Or what's your thoughts on that, Tom?
Yeah, I think you've got to be aware of them. So one of the things as a psychologist, I think once you qualify, and then it's very easy to kind of go, oh, great. Like, that's it then, is it? And for instance, for me, lockdown was a great opportunity to do some more CPD stuff that I'd probably neglected a little bit. Things like mindfulness and breathing. I've had conversations in recent weeks with someone who studies primarily breathing. So they're not a psychologist, but they're an expert in that field. I think for me, it's interesting for your own internal dialogue, because I think naturally I'd go, well, I have to be an expert in all these things. But it's very hard to do that, because you become a little bit of a jack of all trades, or you have a bit of knowledge on everything, which can be dangerous. So I think from my point of view, it's about knowing, you have to have a certain level of knowledge and education about those things. I think you have to buy into them, and you have to be aware that people can now access these things. Like you can use the Headspace app, for instance, and you could really start to build that awareness and those skills that go into that. Breathing, you could go and work with a breathing coach, or you could read the breathing books and start to understand that. And I think athletes are doing that more and more. So you have to be aware of it, but I don't think you have to be an expert in everything, because I think that would it's impossible. From my point of view, I think you have to have that awareness and stay abreast of it. But realize there are people out there who probably know more than you as well.
What's coming next, Tom? Because like a lot of those things are quite new, and again, young people are getting more and more open-minded, more and more experimental, and trying to tap into something to get an edge. What's coming next, Tom?
I think it's technology. I think young people want their or have their worlds in their pockets effectively. I think finding ways of psychology being more usable and tangible and applied. You look at the use of technology in football. I'm thinking of kind of the virtual reality stuff that's being done by various different companies, how that works in football, in rugby, sports like the NFL, but also in sports like golf. We have simulators, but can you go beyond that? So I'm not a technological expert, but I can definitely see that the psychological elements of repetition, of visualization, putting yourself in those scenarios and being able to practice in a slightly smarter way that's not just hitting balls, for instance, or that's not so physically demanding. I think that's probably the next area that's already kind of coming out, isn't it? And being talked about more and more. But I would say it's that side of it, that technology.
Yeah, watch this space. Yeah, there's certainly plenty of startups kind of specialize in that area and getting into the market, because as we're saying, everybody's trying to get an edge. Everybody's trying to get just 1% better than their rival. I think
I think that area is fascinating. Like I say, it's not my area of expertise, and it would fit into that category where I see in a psychologist role, you might still have to be vulnerable enough as a professional to go, you know what, I need to bolt on some technology here. I need to partner with someone, or I need to kind of step back and let someone else come into the forefront to benefit that athlete or to benefit that person. What can be quite difficult is to kind of, from that ego perspective, is to go internally to go, it's okay not to know it all. It's okay to work in collaboration with people, because that's for the betterment of that individual or that team.
Yeah, very good. Tom, I feel like we could talk all day, but we've both got day jobs. But Tom, thanks so much for coming on. That's been really interesting to hear your journey and your input to various different sports teams and people and the impact that you've had. So thanks so much for coming on the Game Week podcast with Keros.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers, Tom.